The air in the grand ballroom was thick with a mix of expensive perfume, hushed laughter, and the low, constant hum of classical music that seemed to float just above the heads of the guests. For Elena, it was just another sound to filter out, like the clinking of ice in crystal glasses and the soft rustle of silk dresses. She moved through the sea of glittering people like a ghost, her white uniform a stark contrast to the deep jewel tones and dark, tailored suits around her. In her hands, a heavy silver tray felt like an extension of her own arms, balanced with a practiced ease that came from countless long nights. On it, flutes of golden champagne bubbled, catching the light from the massive chandeliers hanging overhead like a galaxy of frozen stars. She wasn't really there, not in her mind. While her body navigated the crowded space, her thoughts were miles away in a damp, cluttered basement lab. She was mentally walking through a complex chemical reaction, visualizing the way molecules would bond and break apart. It was a puzzle she had been trying to solve for weeks, a single step in a much larger, much more important experiment. This party, this whole world of fleeting wealth and shallow conversations, was just a means to an end. Every tip she earned, every penny she saved, was a brick in the foundation of her real life. A life where she wasn't invisible, where her work could actually mean something. She thought of her younger brother, his small face pale in a hospital bed, and the promise she had made to him. That promise was the fuel that kept her going through nights like this. Her eyes scanned the room, not as a guest admiring the decor, but as a worker spotting her next target. A man in a crisp tuxedo, his laugh a little too loud, was signaling for another drink. Elena started towards him, offering a small, professional smile that she had perfected over time. It was a smile that said, "I am here to help, but I am not part of your world." It was a shield. As she wove between a group of women dripping in diamonds, she caught snippets of their conversation. They were talking about a trip to a private island, complaining about the inconvenience of their private jets. It was a language so foreign to her it might as well have been from another planet. And then she saw him. The reason for this whole extravagant gathering. Julian Croft. He was standing in the center of the room, a circle of admirers hanging on his every word. He was younger than she expected, with a perfectly styled smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a suit that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition, and he held a glass of whiskey as if it were a scepter. His voice, even from a distance, was booming and full of a self-assured confidence that seemed to push the air itself out of the way. He was telling a story and everyone was laughing. Elena felt a familiar knot of tighten in her stomach. She had seen his type before. People who believed their money gave them the right to own everything and everyone around them. She quickly looked away, focusing on her job. The man with the loud laugh took a glass from her tray without a word of thanks, his attention already back on his own conversation. Elena turned and made her way back towards the bar, her path taking her uncomfortably close to Julian's circle. She kept her head down, trying to be as small and unnoticeable as possible. She could hear his voice clearly now. He was talking about his latest business deal. A hostile takeover, he described with the glee of a pirate recounting a plunder. He used words like crushed and decimated, and his audience laughed and cheered as if he were a hero in a movie, just as she was about to pass. One of the men in the group, gesturing wildly to emphasize a point, backed into her. The jolt was sudden and sharp. Elena stumbled, her feet tangling in the hem of her own uniform. For a heart-stopping moment, the tray tilted. The champagne flutes slid, clinking together in a frantic musical warning. She fought to regain her balance, her muscles screaming, but it was too late. Two of the flutes toppled over the edge of the tray. The golden liquid arced through the air in what felt like slow motion before splashing onto the pristine white cuff of Julian Croft's expensive suit. The world seemed to stop. The music, the chatter, the laughter, it all faded into a dead silence. Every eye in the vicinity turned towards her. Elena's face flushed with a heat so intense it felt like her skin was on fire. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She fumbled for a napkin, her hands shaking. "It was an accident. He didn't see me." Julian looked down at the dark, wet stain spreading on his sleeve. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. He didn't look at the man who had bumped into her. He looked only at her. He slowly lifted his head, and his eyes locked onto hers. They were like chips of ice. "An accident?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. An accident is when you spill something on yourself. When you spill something on me, it's incompetence. Do you know how much this suit costs? Probably more than you make in a year. A few people in the crowd snickered. Elena felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, so strong it made her dizzy. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She could feel the tears pricking at the back of her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not cry. Not in front of him. Not in front of all of them. She just stood there, the napkin clutched in her hand, feeling small and worthless. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Julian commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you even listening? Or is that simple little brain of yours too overwhelmed? Just get this cleaned up and get out of my sight. You're a distraction." He turned away from her then, dismissing her as if she were a piece of trash. He addressed his adoring crowd, his booming voice returning instantly. "As I was saying, the key to a successful acquisition is a complete lack of sentimentality." The laughter and chatter resumed, the momentary disruption forgotten by everyone. Everyone except Elena. She stood frozen for a second longer, the napkin still in her hand, the echo of his words ringing in her ears. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she bent down, her face burning with shame, and began to dab at the few drops of champagne that had landed on the polished marble floor. She was just a waitress again, invisible, but this time the invisibility felt less like a shield and more like a wound. The cool night air did little to soothe the burning in Elena's cheeks. She had slipped out a side door into a small, ornate garden, the city lights twinkling in the distance like a distant, unfeeling galaxy. She leaned against the cold stone railing, taking deep, shaky breaths. The words Julian Croft had spoken echoed in her mind, each one a tiny, sharp needle. Incompetence. Simple little brain. She knew she shouldn't let it get to her. She knew his opinion didn't matter. But in that moment, surrounded by a world she could only peek into, his words felt like the absolute truth. She was just a waitress from the other side of the tracks, a girl who didn't belong. The promise she made to her brother felt a million miles away, a childish dream in a world of harsh realities. After a few minutes, she straightened up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She couldn't stay out here. She had a job to do. Rent was due, and her lab supplies weren't going to buy themselves. She took one last look at the distant city, a silent promise to herself that she would not let this man, or any of them, break her. She would go back in there, hold her head high, and do her job. She would be invisible, a ghost, and she would survive the night. When she re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The low hum of conversation had quieted down, and all eyes were turned towards the stage. A spotlight cut through the dimmed lights, illuminating a single podium. And there he was, Julian Croft, standing center stage, a king addressing his court. He had changed his suit, the stained one replaced by an equally sharp, dark blue one. He looked confident, powerful, and completely in control. He smiled, and the crowd smiled with him. It was as if the incident with Elena had never happened. A minor inconvenience swept under the rug of his immense ego. Elena kept to the walls, collecting empty glasses and plates, trying to be a shadow. She listened to Julian's voice booming through the speakers, smooth and polished like a river stone. He was talking about his foundation, about the children's hospital that had received his generous donation. He spoke of giving back and creating a legacy, his voice thick with a practiced emotion that didn't quite reach his eyes. He painted a picture of himself as a savior, a visionary, a man who cared deeply about the less fortunate. The audience was captivated, nodding along, their faces filled with admiration. "We are the lucky ones," he declared, his arms outstretched. "We have been given so much. And with great fortune comes great responsibility. It is our duty to reach down and lift up those who cannot lift themselves, to provide opportunities where there are none. He paused for effect, letting his words hang in the air. Elena watched from the shadows, a bitter taste in her mouth. He was talking about people like her, people he had just dismissed as incompetent and simple. He was talking about her brother, a child he would never see, whose life depended on the kind of research his money could fund, but wouldn't. Because it wasn't glamorous enough, Julian's speech went on. A masterclass in self-promotion disguised as philanthropy. He talked about his struggles, his humble beginnings, which sounded anything but humble to Elena. He spoke of his vision and his drive, as if he were the only person in the world who had ever worked hard. The crowd ate it up, applauding at all the right moments. Elena felt a strange mix of anger and pity. This man had everything, yet he was so empty he needed the constant validation of hundreds of strangers. He needed to feel superior, to build himself up by putting others down. As his speech reached its crescendo, his tone shifted. It became more playful, more conspiratorial. "But you know," he said, leaning into the microphone, a mischievous glint in his eye, "it's easy to get lost in all this. In the champagne, the fancy clothes, the big numbers. It's easy to forget about the real world out there. The world of hard work and struggle. The world of the people who truly make this country run." His eyes began to scan the room, a predator looking for its prey. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what was coming. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the velvet curtains behind her, but it was too late. His eyes found her. He froze for a second, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He had found his prop. "In fact," he said, his voice booming across the silent room, "I see a perfect example right now." He pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at her. "You there, the young lady in the uniform. Yes, you. Don't be shy. Come on up here." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All heads turned to look at Elena. She felt like a deer caught in the headlights. She shook her head, a small, desperate gesture. "No, thank you," she mouthed, but her voice was gone. "Oh, come now, don't be modest," Julian chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "We want to honor you. We want to celebrate the backbone of our society. Come on up. Let everyone see what a real, hard-working American looks like." The crowd started to murmur, some people laughing, others looking on with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The pressure was immense. It was a command, not a request. To refuse would be to cause a scene, to create an even bigger spectacle. To accept was to walk into the lion's den. With a sense of dread, Elena felt her feet begin to move. It was as if she were watching herself from a distance, a puppet on invisible strings. She walked through the parting crowd, the sea of faces a blur of pity, amusement, and cold indifference. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step was heavy with the weight of their stares. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. As she climbed the steps, the spotlight hit her full force, blinding her. She could feel the heat of the lights on her skin, the eyes of hundreds of people on her back. Julian Croft greeted her at the top of the steps, a triumphant smirk on his face. He slung a heavy arm around her shoulders, pulling her close to him. The smell of his cologne was overpowering, a mix of sandalwood and arrogance. He turned her to face the crowd, presenting her like a prize he had just won. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice vibrating through her body, "I give you the help." The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and nervous laughter. Elena stood there, frozen, her hands clasped in front of her, her knuckles white. She was a statue of shame, a living, breathing punchline to a joke she didn't understand. She was on display, a specimen for the rich to gawk at, and there was nowhere to run. The spotlight was her cage, and Julian Croft was her cruel, smiling keeper. The heat from the stage lights was a physical weight, pressing down on Elena's shoulders. Julian Croft's arm, heavy and possessive, felt like a chain holding her in place. She could smell his expensive cologne, a scent that now smelled like victory to him and poison to her. In front of her, the ballroom had transformed into a single, massive entity. Hundreds of eyes were all focused on her, some with pity, some with cruel amusement, but most with a detached curiosity as if they were watching a play. She felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild, trapped bird trying to escape its cage. She wanted to run, to disappear, to become the ghost she had tried so hard to be just minutes earlier. "Well, don't be shy now," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, making her flinch. He squeezed her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a threat. "Tell everyone your name." Elena's throat was dry. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. It came out as a small, shaky whisper. "Elena. Elena," Julian repeated, as if it were the most charming, simple name he had ever heard. A beautiful, simple name for a hard-working girl. Isn't she wonderful, folks? A smattering of applause and more laughter rippled through the crowd. "So, Elena, tell us, how long have you been a waitress?" "A few years," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on a loose thread on the carpet. "A few years?" Julian exclaimed, turning to the audience with a wide grin. "Dedication. I like that. Now, I'm curious, and I'm sure everyone else is too. What's the biggest tip you've ever received in a single night? Go on, don't be shy. Give us a number." The question was designed to humiliate. It was a way of reminding her and everyone else of the vast financial chasm that separated them. She felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. I don't know. Maybe $100? $100. To these people, it was less than the cost of a single bottle of wine on their tables. The crowd tittered again. Julian patted her back. $100. Fantastic, see? This is what I'm talking about. This is the real world. Every dollar counts, doesn't it, Elena? He was milking it, drawing out her discomfort for his own entertainment. He was the master of ceremonies, and she was his unwilling act. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still picked up by the microphone. "You're doing a great job, really. But it must be tough, isn't it? All this running around, remembering who gets the water and who gets the wine. It's a lot to keep track of." He paused, letting the condescension hang in the air. "So, I have one last question for you. The most important one of the night." He turned her to face him fully, his smirk widening. He was enjoying this far too much. "Tell all these good people, what is the most complex, most difficult problem you had to solve with that brilliant mind of yours tonight? Was it figuring out which fork was the salad fork?" The question hung there, dripping with venom. It was the final, perfect insult. The punchline he had been building towards. The ballroom erupted in laughter. It was louder this time, more confident. It was the laughter of people who felt secure in their own superiority, who knew they were in on the joke and she was the butt of it. Elena felt the tears she had been fighting back all night well up in her eyes. Her vision blurred. The hundreds of faces merged into a single, mocking swirl of color and light, but then something inside her snapped. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, firm click, like a lock turning into place. The promise she had made to her brother, the memory of his small, brave face flashed in her mind. She thought of the long, sleepless nights in the lab, the frustration of failed experiments, the tiny glimmers of hope that kept her going. She thought about the real problems, the ones that mattered. This man, this room, this entire ridiculous spectacle was nothing. It was noise. Her body, which had been rigid with shame, seemed to relax. A strange calm washed over her. The laughter of the crowd faded into a dull roar in the background. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes clear and dry, finding Julian's. He was still smiling, expecting her to crumble. But she didn't. She just looked at him, a look so steady and intense that his own smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached up and took the microphone from its stand. The sudden movement and the soft screech of the microphone being detached cut through the laughter. The room fell silent, startled by the unexpected action. Elena held the microphone in both hands, her grip firm. She was no longer the trembling girl being held on stage. She was a woman standing on her own 2 feet. She turned to face the silent, waiting crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. "Actually, Mr. Croft," she began, her tone even, "the most complex problem I'm working on involves protein folding and enzymatic pathways to create a novel enzyme that could potentially target and destroy the cellular structure of pediatric glioblastoma." A confused hush fell over the ballroom. The technical words, spoken so simply and confidently, were like a foreign language to most of the guests. They looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and dawning realization. "This was not part of the script," Elena continued, her voice gaining a little more strength. "You see, I'm not just a waitress. That's just what I do to pay my bills. I'm a doctoral candidate in biochemistry at the same university you just donated a building to." She let that sink in, her eyes sweeping across the stunned faces. "And your donation, while generous, is going toward a new administrative wing for the Children's Hospital. It's a beautiful building, I'm sure. Very impressive." She paused, her gaze returning to Julian, whose face was slowly turning from smug confusion to pale shock. "The research I'm describing, the research that could actually save the children you're celebrating tonight, is being conducted in a damp, underfunded basement lab. We don't have the funding for a new mass spectrometer. We're running simulations on computers that are a decade old. We have to choose between buying reagents for our experiments or paying for the electricity to keep our equipment running." The silence in the room was now absolute. It was thick, heavy, and charged with a new kind of energy. The guests were no longer laughing. They were listening, really listening, for the first time all night. Elena had not just taken the stage. She had completely changed the subject of the evening. She looked directly at the man who had tried to humiliate her, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. "So, to answer your question, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that no one could have predicted, "the most complex problem I'm trying to solve is how to cure a devastating childhood cancer with almost no resources, while people like you use that same disease as a prop to feel superior at a party. You asked what I think about your money? I think it's being wasted." The words hung in the air, shimmering with a truth that was both beautiful and terrible. For a full 10 seconds, the grand ballroom was completely, utterly silent. It wasn't the quiet of a respectful audience. It was the stunned, breathless silence of a world that had just been tilted on its axis. The low hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink from the kitchen, the soft rustle of a dress, it all seemed to stop. The only sound was the frantic, silent beating of 100 hearts, all caught in the same moment of profound shock. The weight of Elena's statement pressed down on everyone, a heavy blanket of reality that smothered the gilded fantasy of the evening. On the stage, Julian Croft was a statue carved from ice and fury. His face, which had been a mask of smug control just moments before, was now a canvas of chaotic emotions. A deep, ugly purple crept up his neck, flooding his cheeks. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on the deck of a boat, utterly exposed and helpless. The arm he had so confidently slung around Elena's shoulder had fallen away. And now he stood alone, bathed in the same spotlight that had felt like a crown just minutes ago, but now felt like an interrogation lamp. He had built a stage to celebrate himself, and she had used it to expose the hollowness of his world. He was a king who had been dethroned in his own castle, in front of all his subjects. The crowd began to shift. The spell was breaking, but the magic was gone, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable self-awareness. A woman in a sequined gown, who had been laughing the loudest at Julian's jokes, suddenly looked down at her diamond bracelet as if it were a cheap trinket. A man with a perfectly manicured beard stared into his half-empty glass of champagne, his reflection a stranger to him. They were all seeing themselves through Elena's eyes, privileged, detached, and complicit in a system that valued administrative wings over saving lives. The party was no longer fun. It was a mirror, and they didn't like what they saw. A low murmur started to ripple through the room, not of laughter, but of whispered conversations and uneasy glances, and then there was a movement. Near the front of the room, an elderly woman, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, Her back ramrod straight, slowly pushed her chair back. It scraped against the marble floor, a small, sharp sound that cut through the heavy silence. Everyone turned to look at her. She was a pillar of the old money community, a woman known for her immense, and more importantly, intelligent philanthropy. She had been watching Elena with an intensity that hadn't wavered. Now she rose to her full, if slight, height. She looked past the humiliated man on the stage, her eyes fixed on the young woman in the simple waitress uniform. Slowly, deliberately, she brought her hands together in front of her. The sound was not loud. It was a single, clear clap. It was a sound of defiance, a statement of respect in a room that had offered none. It was a crack in the wall of shame, a tiny spark of light in the darkness. For a moment, that single clap was the only sound. Then a man a few tables over joined in. Then another. The sound grew, hesitant at first, then stronger, more confident. It was a wave building in the distance, gathering power and speed. Soon, the entire front section of the room was on their feet, applauding. The sound was no longer a collection of individual claps. It was a single, thunderous roar that filled the ballroom, shaking the very foundations of the building. It was an ovation not for a performance, but for an act of profound courage. It was the sound of 100 people, shamed into remembering their own humanity, applauding the one person among them who had never forgotten it. The applause was for the brother in the hospital bed. It was for the frustrated scientists in the damp basement lab. It was for the truth spoken simply and without fear. It was, most of all, a judgment. Every clap was a rejection of Julian Croft and the hollow world he represented. He stood there, small and pathetic as the sound washed over him. He tried to say something, reaching for the microphone that Elena had so calmly placed back in its stand. "Now, see here," he began, his voice a weak, reedy thing that was completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the crowd. He was a ghost, shouting into a hurricane that he had created. No one was listening. He had lost control of the room, the narrative, and himself. He was just a man in an expensive suit, being loudly and publicly forgiven by the very people he had tried to corrupt with his cruelty. But Elena was not watching him. She was not basking in the glory of the moment. As the applause swelled, she simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the elderly woman who had started it all. It was a nod of shared understanding, a silent thank you between two women from different worlds who recognized a kindred spirit. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't march triumphantly. She just walked, her back straight, her steps measured and calm. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had carried when she was clearing tables. The crowd parted for her like the sea. As she walked down the steps from the stage and through the ballroom, the applause didn't stop. People reached out, not to touch her, but just to be closer to the energy she radiated. Their faces were no longer filled with pity or amusement, but with a deep, abiding respect. She was no longer a waitress. She was a symbol. She was the answer to a question they hadn't even known. They were asking. She didn't stop to collect her things from the staff room. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She just kept walking, her path clear, her destination certain. She pushed through the heavy main doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The sound of the applause followed her for a moment, a fading echo of the world she had just left behind. Then the doors swung shut, and she was alone in the quiet of the night under a vast, star-filled sky. She took a deep breath, the first clean, easy breath she had taken all night. She had walked into that building as a ghost, and she was walking out as a force of nature. The party was over, but her work was just beginning. The cool night air felt like a gift after the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. Elena didn't stop walking until the sound of the applause was a distant memory, swallowed by the city's constant hum. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to move, to put as much space as possible between herself and the wreckage she had left behind. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of it all. The words she had spoken on stage felt like they belonged to someone else, a braver, more powerful version of herself that had been unlocked by Julian Croft's cruelty. She found herself at a bus stop. The orange glow of the shelter, a small island of light in the darkness. She sat on the hard plastic bench, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. She saw Julian's smug face, the amused pity in the eyes of the crowd, and then the shift. The moment the silence fell, the look of shock on their faces when she spoke her truth. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt necessary. Like a pressure valve had been released, not just for her, but for everyone in that room who had ever felt small, overlooked, or underestimated. She pulled out her phone, her hands still shaking slightly, and saw it was already blowing up. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of notifications. She ignored them all, her thumb hovering over her brother's contact picture before she put the phone away. Not yet. She didn't have the words. The bus ride was a blur of passing lights and reflection. She saw her own face in the dark window, pale and tired, but with a new light in her eyes she didn't recognize. She got off a few blocks from the university and walked the rest of the way. Her sanctuary wasn't her small, lonely apartment. It was the lab. She let herself in with her key, the familiar click of the lock a comforting sound. The lab was exactly as she had left it, cluttered, smelling of antiseptic and old coffee with the low, steady hum of the refrigerator that held their precious samples. This was her world. A world of beakers and data, of hope and frustration. A world that was real. She sank into her worn-out chair at her desk, laying her head in her hands. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she lose her job? Would Julian Croft try to ruin her? The fear was still there, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, but it was drowned out by a louder, more persistent thought: she had done the right thing. For her brother, for her team, for every child fighting a battle they shouldn't have to. She closed her eyes and for the first time in a very long time, felt a sense of peace. She woke up a few hours later, the first light of dawn filtering through the small, grimy window. Her phone was buzzing insistently on the desk. This time she picked it up. The screen was a flood of messages, but it wasn't just calls from friends and family. There were emails from news reporters, requests for interviews from TV shows, and a link that had been sent to her 100 times. She clicked on it, her heart pounding. It was a video. Shot shakily from the back of the ballroom, the audio was surprisingly clear. She watched herself walk onto the stage, saw the look of dread on her own face. She watched Julian mock her, heard the cruel laughter of the crowd. And then she watched herself take the microphone. She listened to her own voice, steady and clear, speaking words that felt more powerful now than they had in the moment. The video ended with the roar of applause as she walked away. The view count below the video was a number she couldn't comprehend. It was in the millions. And it was climbing. The story was everywhere. It wasn't just a video. It was a phenomenon. Hashtags were trending. People were drawing cartoons, writing songs, and sharing their own stories of being underestimated. The waitress in the lab, they were calling her. She was an accidental hero, a symbol of resistance against a world of hollow privilege. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and incredible all at once. A few hours later, as she was staring at the data from her last experiment, trying to find a moment of normalcy, the lab door opened. An older woman stood there, her silver hair pinned up neatly, dressed in a simple but elegant pantsuit. It was the woman from the party, the one who had started the applause. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her voice warm and kind. "I had a bit of trouble finding this place. The university grounds are quite large." Elena stood up, speechless. You're here." "I am," the woman said with a gentle smile. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I have been trying to reach you. What you did last night was one of the bravest things I have ever witnessed. You spoke a truth that many of us in that room have known for a long time but have been too comfortable to say." She walked further into the lab, her eyes taking in the worn-out equipment, the peeling paint on the walls. "You were right. This is no place to try and save the world." That day, everything changed. Eleanor Vance became more than just a supporter. She became a partner. She used her influence and her fortune to do what Julian Croft's donation had not: she funded the science. Within a week, a press conference was held. Eleanor announced the creation of the HOPE Initiative, a research foundation dedicated solely to funding Eleanor's work and projects like it. The response was instantaneous. The viral video had already opened the floodgates, and now, with a legitimate, respected foundation leading the charge, donations poured in from all over the world. Small donations from students, large ones from other philanthropists who had been shamed by Eleanor's example. Julian Croft's empire began to crumble. His company's stock plummeted as sponsors pulled out and customers boycotted his products. The PR nightmare was absolute. He was no longer a visionary. He was a villain in a story that the whole world was watching. After a week of silence, he was forced to make a public statement. It was a hollow, insincere apology, but it came with a grand gesture. In a desperate attempt to save his reputation, he announced that he would be matching, dollar for dollar, every donation made to the HOPE Initiative. The man who had mocked her for a $100 tip was now being forced to write a check for millions. It was the ultimate, most satisfying irony. A month later, Elena stood in a brand-new, state-of-the-art research facility. It was bright and clean, filled with the best equipment money could buy. Her team from the old lab was with her, their faces alight with a hope that had once been a distant dream. They had new colleagues, a bigger budget, and a mandate to chase down a cure without worrying about the cost. The media had tried to make her a celebrity, but she had politely declined most interviews. She wasn't a hero. She was a scientist. Her work wasn't done on a stage in front of a camera. It was done here, in the lab. That afternoon, she left the new facility and drove to the hospital. She walked into her brother's room, a smile on her face. He was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in months. "Guess what?" she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "We're going to win." He grinned back at her, a familiar, mischievous sparkle in his eyes. "I never doubted it for a second," he said. Later that night, long after the sun had set, Elena went back to the lab. The building was quiet and empty. The cameras were gone, the reporters had left, and the world had moved on to the next big story. But she was still there. She put on a white lab coat, the crisp cotton feeling like a suit of armor. She looked around at the silent machines, at the charts on the walls, at the possibilities that filled the air. The party was over, the speech was a memory, and the viral video was already old news. All of that was just the beginning. The real work, the work that mattered, was just getting started, and she couldn't wait to dive in.